Explanation rounds today. Uh, just a few things to flag. We are going to debate the motion of the last round, that is round 8. We are also wanting to caveat a few important things because this is indeed a closed round. So we are going to give arguments that we thought of that we, for many reasons, selected for the purposes today. This does not mean that you giving these arguments or not giving these arguments is an indication of the call in your room. It does not indicate anything of what we think the call is in our room. We also think that there are many different ways to analyze the same point, which would lead to different calls by the end of the day. So don't try and interpret this what actually the call was. Do try to learn from this how to potentially maybe do your cases in a slightly different way. Also, just a reminder, today we want to focus a bit on weighings, and this is something that the panel is going to also focus on when discussing the call for us. So this is an encouragement for second speakers to also do weighings, but also attention for you to try to follow up weighings within the debate that we are going to do. And yeah, that's it. The theme today is obviously dinos versus babies. I'm going to be the selected baby to start. And yeah, I'm going to set my timer, just making sure my panel, Macharia, Jess, you ready? Awesome. Starting in 3, 2, 1. What is this debate about? Just to clarify very quickly what we think it is. Firstly, we think that some forms of academic research are some things that we would see much less under our side of the debate. So things such as critical race theory, gender studies, etc., are things that we would see researched less in the first place under our side. To be clear, other forms of research would still exist. Presumably inequality would still be researched within sociology, economy, etc. Presumably police brutality would still be researched within criminology. We think that there are many other forms of research which would still remain, just not the scope that actually presents them as directly tied to this. Secondly, the lingo that we are probably using is something that we want to simplify under our side of the debate. So I'm going to talk a bit more in my speech about what is actually changing in the movements, but please note a bullet that opposition has to bite here. They have to concede that the lingo under their side is one that uses the more complex academic linguistics, such as microaggressions, internalized misogyny, and all of that jazz, even if they're going to say that there are many other forms of social movements still existing, lingo changes. Lastly, as I'm going to prove in my point, I think that we are also losing some positions of leading within the movement into academics, which are going to be more prominent within the movements themselves, invited to interviews, etc. Two main points I'm going to discuss in my speech. Firstly, on involvement and buy-in, both from the perspective of the minorities themselves and from the general society. And secondly, on reaching solutions and why we think we actually have better ways to reach solutions under our side than through academic research. Are there any clarifications before I begin my speech? Cool. Awesome. Let's start with the first point. Just to clear it off the bat, why do we think that there is a significant trade-off between this and actually getting people to talk about their lived experiences in positions of leadership under the world where we have the academia involved? Firstly, we think to many extents, the academics are going to be the ones that are going to be invited. Even if opposition wants to say that they will try to step away and be good and moderate and not actually take the lead, we think that when you have the media, the newspapers, the journals actually inviting people, they would always prioritize inviting the people that have more of the ethos, the people that have more of the name behind them, and therefore more likely to approach these when they have this alternative, as opposed to the actual people with the lived experience who might sound less good on TV because they have slightly less good jargon to use, etc. We think under our side, they would still want to review all of the issues because these are hot topics, but they would have to go to the people on the ground because they wouldn't have alternatives. Secondly, we think that even when people do talk about their lived experience, they are going to always be compared to the academics, meaning that people are going to see them as less, sadly, smart. They are going to compare them to the academics that talk in other fields and see why are they using much less good jargon? Why are they not having a degree from Harvard? So we think that they're going to be somewhat discredited as opposed to the people from the movement that do have the higher degrees. Thirdly, we think that these are also going to be heavily moderated. So when they do talk, they will talk less about their personal experiences. They will talk more about what the moderators and the academics tell them. That is, using more of the jargon and the lingo, less talking about their personal things, more about the research, etc. Why is it bad? Firstly, impact on how it alienates minorities. Few things on that. We think minorities are just much less likely to identify with the things that they say in the first place. Lived experiences are something that you as a minority and someone that has faced structural problems can identify with and be mobilized by and say, hey, this has happened to me. I should follow this movement. I can seek help from this movement. Whereas if you see an academic talking about a research, this is something that you're much less attached to. You feel often even that you don't have the ability to understand this, even if you do, because you have like the imposter syndrome that often characterizes people that suffer from discrimination because you were like often not accepted to the academia when you wanted to, etc. Secondly, we think a lot of this is just actively condescending. Like when I was not a feminist in high school and people used to tell me that I have internalized misogyny, I wanted to tell them to what like the point is, it makes you feel like they're telling you that they know your struggle better than you, and this makes you want to not want to actually follow through. Thirdly, it also makes them feel like they're focusing on the wrong things. Microaggressions, if you don't understand it deeply, sounds like a very heavy mitigation of your problems. My problems aren't micro, they are macro. Now, of course, there's nuance to this, but nuance is very hard to explain when you don't have much actual attention span of the audience to get it. Meaning that many people are just going to not understand and feel like their stories are being stolen. Lastly, we think also in many areas, especially in developing countries, there's going to be a direct alienation of not wanting to be associated with this. If my struggle is going to be characterized as Western and white, it is something that I'm going to actively not want to be associated with. If I'm part of a minority that was oppressed by white people historically, etc., meaning that I am much less likely to join the movement, go on protests, actually speak up, and seek help of the movement. But secondly, we think it's also alienating to the vast majority of society, not just the minorities themselves. Because we think that it is much less mobilizing. When you talk about research, it's dry. It's not something that is interesting to listen to. It's not something that drags your attention and actually what makes you care about this significantly, as opposed to hearing about an empathetic story that draws your emotions from someone who tells their lived experience. But secondly, we think a lot of these concepts are very hard to understand and easy to misconstrue. When you say microaggressions, it's very easy for people to mock this and say, oh, look at these snowflakes getting hurt by the small things and actually how privileged they are to get hurt by the small things. When you say things such as there is an structural racism or misogyny within society, people are going to raise an eyebrow and say, I'm not a misogynist. I love women. My mom is a woman. My girlfriend is a woman. These concepts are hard to understand for people who don't actually understand the nuance in the first place, and therefore we are much less likely to get buy-in from them as well. On all those grounds, we think we just get much more support under our side. Before I move on, Ben, go ahead.
Do you think that these academic, the kind of information that's conveyed in the academicization is actually inaccurate, or would you concede that it is a substantially accurate way most of the time of describing the world and describing these problems?
Okay, cool. I'm just getting to this in my second point. So let's talk about why research is bad. Okay, several things that are important to note here. Firstly, we think that the research is not actually going to discuss many of the things that it should. We think that even if academics have the best of incentives, they have several blind spots as people who are often from more privileged backgrounds, meaning that they are still likely to prioritize the wrong things. We see it in the abundance of research about things such as gender discrimination in positions in the academy, which is obviously terrible, but also only impacts very few women who are already very privileged. So we see the research is already going in the wrong directions. Secondly, we think that there is a natural conservative tendency and hierarchy within the academy. Because you want to get positions and tenure, you don't want to directly contradict people who came before you. So if there were prior research that says, as many prior research says, there is technically no difference between shooting of black people and white people in the US if you compare it by the numbers who commit crime, you do not want to go against it and actually be critical about it because the professor who is going to give you tenure has wrote it. So you probably want to stay very conservative in the way that you do this research. Secondly, we think that the fact that this research is done through this theme also makes it seem much less objective, right? When it is done through gender studies, people are already critical about this and don't want to listen to what you say, as opposed to if it would have been done through other fields of studies, which would be seen as like much more objective and much more likely to get people to listen to. For all these reasons, beg you to propose.
All right, we thank that speaker for that speech. We now welcome the leader of opposition. Jess, are you ready?
Yep.
All right.
Okay, just making sure I'm audible.
Yep, I can hear you.
Great. Starting my speech in just 1 second. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Look, I'm a bit rusty, so I'm not going to have any impressive intros. I'm just going to dive right in, and my points are exactly on the same issues, one on representation buy-in, the other one on what sort of research is actually produced. Let's start with research, because here I honestly think what the Gov is telling us is highly, highly improbable. First of all, they tell us academics are usually privileged people who only research things like the discrimination that happens in academia and so on. We say this is false for several reasons. One, we have literally decades of affirmative action within academia that specifically stresses getting more people from various minority groups in, getting more research grants according to diversity criteria. We think there are many people within academia that actually care about this, and we believe that these are exactly the people who also gravitate specifically towards the fields that research social justice, people like Edward Said, people like the founders of post-colonial theory. These are not the white privileged people that opening government is talking about. Secondly, they say there is a hierarchy in academia and you're really scared of disputing what other people have said. That's literally the set of incentives that academia has. It's the opposite of that. Like what you want to do is show that your research is innovative, show that your research is critical, showing that your research goes into unexplored fields. That means if many things have already been explored, if a theme has been explored in many ways, you want to focus on a niche group, you want to focus on the next thing. Even if you are yourself a privileged person, you have a clear incentive to go into a group that has not yet been researched, somewhere whose lived experiences have not yet been told. That's exactly the sort of incentive you have. Let's see what is more on that. Yeah, I think that basically covers it. I will say the comparative is not explained at all by government, and that's really problematic because we believe that in social movements right now, power is also being hijacked by the most privileged within that group. Like, for example, gay men monopolizing the LGBTQA movement for a long period of time. And we're saying that these groups, and this is a process that happens within every social movement, just the people with more time, more capital, the ones you want to invite on TV and so on. The one thing that changes here is, first of all, these people are likely very knowledgeable about the field that they're studying in general, therefore able to relate more experiences and study and represent the experience of more people, and they have the set of incentives to do exactly that. We believe that's much, much better. Secondly, let's talk about buy-in and representation. So they say, academics go on panels, on TV panels, and only represent, and therefore you don't get representation of lived experiences. First of all, qualitative research is exactly representing people's lived experiences. That's the first thing. Second of all, they've not shown that presenting people's lived experiences in itself generates sympathy from the general public or even from that TV interviewer. What is likely to happen is people are very easily able to dismiss this by saying, oh, that's just one person's experience. That's not so meaningful. However, when you have an academic that's both able to relay the lived experiences of multiple people and say, we can generalize from those lived experiences to what most people within this group are experiencing, and they have the veneer of science behind them, we believe that's much more persuasive. We believe you get both people's stories and their ability to become generalizable and become actionable as policy. Then they say they're always going to, when you invite other people, they're going to be compared to academics and then be seen in a more bad way. Note, what currently happens is you have a trans activist on the one hand, and you have Jordan Peterson, the Harvard professor, on the other hand, who attacks that person and who seems smarter and has all these qualifications that opening government is talking about. We believe it's much better when we're able to face him with another academic who is also, in many cases, a trans person or a person of color or a person who's had those lived experiences themselves. Thirdly, when you talk about the developing world, they have a very, very strong assumption there that the people talking on their side of the house are actually the people from the developing world and not movements speaking on their behalf, white saviors and so on. We believe it's much more likely actually to have people from the developing world in Western academia, because that's one of the best avenues to get get into a Western country from a developing country and to get scholarships and all these different things. Finally, they say, finally, on how academics actually speak on TV and so on, we believe they usually pick the academics that speak really fluently and are able to present a topic. You know, for example, university debaters who also have a higher degree. And we believe that these people are not idiots. They know how to make what they're saying more accessible to the average audience. Finally, note that academics really have to do the work of making their research accessible, in the sense that if I need to be hired, let's say I'm a student of Jewish mysticism, that's quite a niche field. However, if I want to be hired, I have to convince the head of the dean of the humanities faculty and the president of the university, and people who have no idea about my research topic. So most academics do have that training as well. Before I go on, Hadar, sure.
A good chunk of conservatives still think that global warming is a Chinese hoax. We don't think that veneer of academia is something that convinces people. Motivating personal stories do.
Okay. Great, thanks. So we believe that the people who don't believe that climate change is real are also not going to believe that, this poor person talking about how their river was polluted. However, and that gets me to my second point, to my final point, if you don't have the science to back you up, you might go wrong. And notice this is really important. Understanding the sort of things that understanding the sort of fixes you have to make and what has worked in the past and what is not is something that academia is uniquely good at doing in terms of generating insights. The likelihood of a social movement being able to do that to the same extent as academia is minimal. The fact that you have people like Sharmila doing research on interviewing thousands of sex workers within the Philippines, asking them what are their barriers, what is stopping them, is much, much better than having a few upper class white feminists sitting in a room discussing what is better for sex workers, which we believe is the likely alternative. Finally, note in terms of persuasiveness, yes, you might not be able to persuade the most radicals, but when you're able to show things like behavioral economics, explaining why poverty happens and things of that sort, we believe that's much, much better in terms of accessibility than in terms of actually persuading people than people presenting their own stories, because this is science behind it, this is Nobel Prizes behind this, and therefore much, much more appealing to the general population. Very, very proud to oppose.
Can everyone hear me? All right, perfect. I think at its core, what opening opposition needed to do in the LO and what they need to do in the DLO, sorry, Macharia, I don't know, I realized you didn't call me up, that's my fault. I can wait a second. Should I keep going?
Just hold on, sorry.
Yeah, my fault.
Mate, I'm on the edge of my seat here, figuring out what I need to do.
Yeah, I'll call you up when it's your turn. Just give me a second. Right. We thank the leader of OP for that speech. We now welcome the Deputy Prime Minister, the eager Deputy Prime Minister, to begin their speech. Here.
Thanks. I think in order to win this debate, what opening opposition had to do is prove to us why it was required for social movements to talk about things like critical Marxism and an understanding of race theory, rather than just say, we thought it was good to not shoot Black people, we think it is good to fight inequality. The simplest solutions are oftentimes the best ones. I think the problem what we get out of opening opposition is there is no actual vision for why you fundamentally convince people about the harms on your side. And I want to point out here that they say they sort of appeal to academia as this unbiased unbiased, sort of beautiful thing. I want to point out that whenever Rod Chetty, a Harvard economist, publishes research about inequality, the right-wingers say, all of that material is exactly why people should be lifting themselves up by their own bootstraps, and the left-wingers say, all of that material is exactly why people need government support. Even if it is true that you can publish sorts of research, what opposition had to do was justify to us why exactly folding that into the social movements was likely to then create some form of positive vision. What I'm going to do is a few things. One, I want to talk about the framing of this debate, why I think what we do is we prioritize academic thought over lived experience. Two, lots of new substantive that results from that. Much of the rebuttal will be integrated. Three, dealing with what Ayal told you in terms of Hadar's constructive and why I think we beat back that. On framing, I think what you do fundamentally is you prioritize things like academic thought over lived experience. And I think what happens on our side is you are much more likely to cater to actually real things that are happening versus the Marxist fundamentals of the movement. I want to point out that this leads to three inherent things that they need to fight with. One is that less individuals that feel themselves wrapped up in the movement are likely to buy in. And I think Hadar tells you this to what we get in a response when Hadar talks about the fact that individuals themselves see their lived experiences not being reflected in the movement, because when people care about academic terms like microaggressions, they feel that their own experiences are diminished. Ayal says, but the problem is that if there is one single lived experience, it is easy to dismiss that. On the converse, academia can say, here is the shared lived experience and why that is united in some form of whatever academic thought there is. I want to point out here that I think we can achieve much of the same sort of like outcome here. Like the entire point of protest movements is they say this is not just one individual having one experience, but lots of people having this shared experience. I think because of how harmful those experiences are, it is likely to be pointed out as something that is relatively salient. I think the second thing is, in order for them to justify this claim, they really needed to prove to you why an academic on Fox News saying all of this sort of perverse, like the way that people interact with the state is rooted in like the way we think about Marxist thought and people interacting with the state from an ideological point of view, which I just don't think was actually that relevant to what people cared about. And I think this is what Hadar tells you, which is that people do not care about the veneer in which academic things are wrapped up in. They care about whether or not the movement is addressing their own concerns. When you do not do this, the individuals themselves do not buy in. I think the second thing is it is far easier to point out that the movement is fundamentally contradictory and out of touch, because academia is far more likely to be elite, yet they endorse like all these sorts of redistributionary sort of things. So if you look at like the vast majority of critiques that like right-wingers have of protest movements, almost all of them point out that there are academics within the movement that endorse things like Marxism, yet somehow manage to own a second home. And I want to point out here that although Ayal says academia is not elite, I think it structurally is. Like if you think about the cost that is associated with the long process of being willing to forego pay for many, many years in order to finally get tenure, it is hard to achieve anything in academia unless you have fundamentally some connections in the field, some association with the field, or some ability to engage with the field. They say there are decades of affirmative action. I say fine, but I do not think this means that you correct for like the economic injustice. So yes, maybe we get like more upper middle class Black people participating in academia. I do not think this necessarily means that you get anything else. The sole and like utter examples of people like Edward Said, I think are too far and few to actually characterize what most of academia is, which is by and large wealthy white men conducting studies on what they think is best for people in poverty. I think the last thing that I wanted to talk about here on framing, though, was that this was likely to create sort of a competition over prestige. That is to say, the reason that you cared about things like academia on their side was because it was appealing to your intellectualism. And I think this is actually important. On our side, the positive vision is extraordinarily simple. Movements cater to your lived experience, and they base things off of their lived experience. On their side, they have to defend a movement. Basically, like I want to point out here that especially when there's limited political capital within the movement and people are competing within the movement, you are far more likely to compete on the axis of whether or not you are prestigious enough in academia. I think this is much worse, because I actually think this is exactly how you get academics like Jordan Peterson sparking up on their side. Because it's not like Jordan Peterson can have any lived experiences to talk about. So when someone is talking about their lived experience, Jordan Peterson can't be like, well, I don't think you have that lived experience. The way that Jordan Peterson gets off is fundamentally that all the social justice movements say, here is our Harvard academic talking about something, and all the conservatives say, here is Jordan Peterson, our Harvard educated person talking about something else. I think the problem was academic thought was always likely to be fundamentally fluid. Lived experiences were something that was hard to challenge, especially when lots of people united on that, but facts and logic like altered however you wanted them to, right? Like Hadar gives you the example of professors that produce research that says that like Roland Frye at Harvard produces research that says that Black people are as likely to get shot by the police as white people, even though that runs contradictory to like other forms of research that people produce. I think there's always some facet of research that is likely to be produced in pernicious ways. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but first, Ayal, go ahead.
Yeah, you never engage with what social movements look like without academia. So, for example, if I have a lived experience and I am the more privileged person within that social movement, then only my lived experience gets shared, and not the ones of other less privileged people within that movement.
So I think we are perfectly fine in saying that this was true like 30, 40 years ago. Like the stories of white feminism, like kicking out like Black feminists and talking about their own lived experiences is, I think, fundamentally true. I think the distinction is in today's day and age, I think it is unlikely to be the case. The vast majority of people care about extraordinarily salient lived experiences. Like the biggest gripe in police brutality in African-American like movements is not whether or not there are like CEOs and enough Black CEOs. It's are people getting shot by the police or not. Those are incredibly important salient experiences. And I think it's kind of like blasé to just say, oh, we don't think the most important things will be talked about. I very quickly want to talk about why research itself becomes worse. I think the biggest problems here that Hadar pointed out are fairly obvious. There is less of a veil of objectivity that happens when you politicize research, when you drag it into social movements. And I think the consequences are twofold. One, even when research exists, because we say, yes, research also exists on our side to the extent that it exists on theirs, except we're fine saying like you don't get research in like certain fields. I think what ends up happening is you don't want to actively research in controversial fields. Like they say you want to research controversy. The experience with Nicole Hannah-Jones being denied tenure for her stance on critical race theory is exactly why you do not want to speak out. But most importantly, you are less likely to do research on those sorts of things. And even when you do, it is not seen as objective. It is seen as something that is liberal. It is seen as something that is biased and Marxist. Very proud to propose.
Cool. Just let me know when it's time to go. Hey, just a heads up, apparently check-in's now open, so we should all go do that.
All right. Thank you, Ben. You preempted what I was going to say. Yeah, let's check in and then we proceed.
Just let me know when you want to go.
Yep, checked in. Jess, are you ready?
Yep.
All right. We thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. We now welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition to conclude the debate and the opening half. Here.
Cool. All right. I can be heard, okay?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay. The first awesome thing about the opposition's case is that we're having a debate about regretting something that happens, and then the opposition blatantly makes up a world for themselves, right? Like, it is ridiculous to say that academics are the only figures that are engaged in public communication on social issues, that you only ever use buzzwords, that you never attempt to elevate people from those sort of perspectives. And in fact, the opposition explicitly concedes that when, in responding to a point of information, a deputy, they say, oh, well, there has in fact been a really substantial shift in terms of both movements and populations responding to this form of politics that preferences the idea that people's lived experiences are extraordinarily important. The opposition does not acknowledge the fact that the opposition in this debate is a team that can absolutely have their cake and eat it too. We can have academics having a substantial role in the provision of information while simultaneously allowing, charismatic, effective public communicators or the stories that the victims of these structures may hold to be prioritized. We can have both. They never demonstrated any kind of mutual exclusivity. And I reckon the reason they didn't is because they can't. Well, I mean, as in, you guys demonstrated that in a literal sense, you can't do both at exactly the same time in a maximalist way. But that just means that we have slightly less airtime for one. We would argue that there's a diminishing returns to both. And so it makes sense to try both. But secondly, the opposition has absolutely no conception of what they want to defend in this debate, right? Because seemingly their main problem in this debate is the idea that academia is elitist. And then when we say, like, well, you know, there's a bunch of structural changes that have been made to make it much less elitist. They say, oh, but it's actually quite elitist because you need to have a fair bit of free time and stuff like that. But to be a leader and public communicator in one of these spaces inherently means that exactly the same trait that you point to, which is the ability to essentially take very low pay for an extended period of time, indicating that you have access to capital from somewhere else or some kind of connections, must inherently be true for you. I'm going to look at the two questions of this debate, firstly on accuracy and secondly on buy-in. Firstly on accuracy. I want to begin by explaining why this is by a considerable margin the more important question of this debate. Firstly, because as Ayal tells you in our leader's speech, obviously, if you do not have a movement that is able to accurately represent the requirements of these social movements and that is able to be extremely introspective and effective at determining what those movements need, you have a movement that agitates for, generates political change for things that are worse, right? That are less effective than the things they could be striking out for. But secondly, again, because we tell you to no response in the leader's speech, if you do not have accuracy, that means that ultimately the messaging that you are pursuing may use language that is more effective, but it comes at the expense of prioritizing issues that speak to fewer people, because an accurate movement is one that is able to identify the issues that affect the most people and affect them the most, which means the opposition's prized consideration of mobilization is ultimately to a degree contingent on accuracy. Before I explain why the opposition absolutely bites the dust on this accuracy question, I'm happy to take a point of information.
Even if you were to explain why people believe the solutions that the academia suggests, I really don't know why we need research to understand that shooting Black people is bad and that inequality is bad.
I think you actually absolutely do. Firstly, to define the scope of the problem. Secondly, to explain what exactly the causes of it are, so that you're able to solve them. Thirdly, so that you're able to figure out effectively the ways in which you communicate to that people, because there are multiple ways in which you can do it. And fourthly, to advance justifications as to why it's not fair, because all of those things are contested. To take a really obvious example, right, for years, as Ayal tells you, there was kind of a consensus held view that the only reason that Black people in America were shot more than white people, amongst like the white community, was because they committed more crimes. And that is obviously bullshit, right? But it required extensive engagement from academics to prove that's not true. So there's 4 grounds upon which you need information in which to do this. The opposition is crazy when they talk about accuracy because they're totally uncomparative. The opposition firstly tells us that research academics have blind spots. Firstly, as I told you, this argument is uncomparative. Movement leaders are likely to suffer from that problem, at least to the same extent. Secondly, this argument is denying what academia is. It is a field of looking as much as possible to objective or verifiable information and generalizing claims amongst the population. And thirdly, of course, the movement still selects the academics ultimately that are being like prioritized. It's not as if like if you get tenured at Harvard, you automatically get national prominence in Black Lives Matter, right? You ultimately still need to be endorsed by the movement, which means if you do have a blind spot, you're not going to get through. The second thing the opposition tells us is the idea that you're like this happens in like less objective fields or something like that. This idea that like, oh, well, if you studied the field of gender studies through economics instead of just calling it gender studies, it would make things better. I don't even think this argument has enough internal rigidity to be self-defeating. I actually don't understand what the idea of not focusing on these things in the correct field is likely to accomplish. The third thing that the opposition wants to tell us here is the idea that the academy is inherently biased. Well, again, that's true on the comparative for the reasons that I previously brought you. Ayal then told you a bunch of stuff which was actually comparative. Firstly, that victims of these forces are likely to be the ones that are most motivated to join academia. There is extensive compulsion in terms of affirmative action pretty much everywhere. And thirdly, they're relatively highly informed and trained to overlook cognitive biases. The last thing the opposition says on this is the idea that like, oh, well, you know, like the Global South does not have as many participants in the academy. But Ayal tells you this is deeply uncomparative as well. A lot of the time, people from the Global South do in fact go to participate in the academy because lots of opportunities are presented for them to do so. But secondly, it's not totally clear what the alternative is in this context. So secondly, on mobilization and buy-in, and I've already noted the contingency involved in this argument to a substantial degree, but let's rebut what the opposition is saying here. And the first like headline response is that you can do both, right? You can have like kooky infographics that use really simple language, and you can have more sophisticated public communication. They're communicating often to different audiences. Often the sophisticated stuff is like working working with governments or it's working with people that are highly informed. There's plenty of characterizations in which that would obviously be more effective. So the opposition needs to show us that this academic stuff sort of leads to this movement being inspiring so much hostility. And then I think the opposition gets the causality totally wrong, because they're sort of like, well, a lot of people don't buy in because this is perceived as sort of like really, this is perceived as really elitist. People dislike it and stuff like that. And I think that that's just a function of being a social justice movement, right? Like, people are naturally challenged by your ideas. I don't think the opposition showed where the delta is on this argument at all. The other idea that we get is that there's a trade-off in terms of lived experiences. Now, this argument would make sense, except for the fact that ultimately these movements are still selecting the people who they want to prioritize. And as the opposition notes, by their argument, this does not happen because the movement still elevates a lot of people with these voices. The last thing that I want to notice here, really, really briefly though, is that the opposition is simply wrong when they make the claim that this policy is going, sorry, that this norm is leading to a huge amount of hostility, precisely because they identify the way in which the movement has been reshaped to prioritize things that are more effective through academic research. For all of these reasons, I'm very happy to oppose.
All right. We thank every speaker for that speech. Very, very interesting debate. We really, really do appreciate your time. And yeah, they've come to the end of the debate. So should you cross house, shake hands, wave at one another. Thank you so much for that training demo debate. So we'll now move to the panel discussion. I'm not sure where it's happening. Is it here?
It's happening here. Yeah, we will leave so you can deliberate. Just a reminder for our viewers in Facebook, if you didn't check in yet, do that now because it's about to close.
Okay. All right, so please leave the room and allow the panelists and I to deliberate on Facebook Live.
Oh, are we doing this live? The last one was
Yeah.
not live. I was not prepared for that.
Apparently it's live. Yeah.
I just
So let's think about, I think it's live. You can ask on the group though.
I just checked this because yeah, I was not prepared for live deliberation. All right, one sec.